It is a week of time-honored ritual politics of protests, bullets, stones, tear gas, tears, death and destruction. When will the cycle of madness come to an end? This is News Gang.
Hata ukiweka sufuria miaka 10 kwa kichwa, bei ya unga itapungua. Hata ufanye maandamano mwaka moja, bei ya unga itapungua. Si bei ya unga itapungua tukisaidia wakulima wazalishe chakula jameni.
What a week it has been. Yet another week of protests. Ladies, gentlemen, welcome back once again on that. I think perhaps to just do a recap and get an understanding of, what this week has been. This is the second day of protests of what was planned for 3 days. We've seen at least tweets and posts from the opposition leader that tomorrow the protests are on. Jamila, maybe we can start with you. What do we know as of day 2 so far?
Okay. Yvonne, I'd like to take us back to last week, Wednesday, when we had protests that resulted in loss of life, that resulted in property being destroyed. Especially, we would all remember what happened in Mlolongo with the SGR. And then after that, that's when the opposition announced 3 more days of maandamano this week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And the government on its part saying that will not allow it to happen. Security operators will be deployed, police officers will be there to make sure that the maandamanos don't happen. And yesterday we saw the fear of maandamano in terms of businesses being shut down. I remember we did a story about how the city center was practically empty and most roads, it looked like a Sunday or a public holiday. Schools, public, primary and secondary school day, public and primary schools in Nairobi, Kisumu and Mombasa were also closed. The railway service was also suspended. So we actually saw a shutdown of normalcy and normal services. But of course now, I think yesterday, in my opinion, the intensity may not have been as had been expected in terms of the maandamanos. Yes, we did witness it happening in various parts of the country. We did witness loss of life. We did witness destruction of property. We did witness tear gas and shooting and maandamano in some parts of the country. But generally, as compared to maybe last week, Wednesday, the situation was a bit more contained by the security forces. They were deployed kila mahali. Kuna wale wa ardhini na kuna wale wa angani. We even had choppers. And I think also we need to remember that today, on Thursday, we still had maandamano. But again, in fact, I remember last evening, I was reading the bulletin and we had a statement from the Ministry of Interior and Education saying that we've been able to contain the security situation and that children can go back to school today. Of course, the fear of the parents was evident because most schools did remain closed and those parents who did take their children to school went back and took them home. So, ni kama kuna hali ya atiati, we say it in Swahili, about maandamano yako ndio, lakini yatakuwa mabaya zaidi ama ndio hali ilivyo. In fact, people are asking me today, kesho bado kuna maandamano? Because it seems like slowly and surely, even today in the city, we had more businesses opening up. And the reason being given by most of these business people is this: we cannot afford another loss. Most of them are business people who depend on malipo ya hiyo siku, mapato ya hiyo siku kuendelea na biashara. So tunafungua biashara, chakula kisiharibike, those who own the food businesses, those who sell vegetables wanasema itaharibike ile tuko nayo. So today and yesterday, the intensity is not as had been expected. I don't know if it meant that the security forces were better prepared and better deployed this time as compared to the previous one, especially last week, Wednesday. But ndio hali ambayo tunashuhudia hivi sasa, in a nutshell.
Yeah, and the other thing that we noticed was the absence of the Azimio leader, Raila Odinga, and indeed the absence of the other leaders as well. I mean, if you compare that with what we saw last week, where they had deployed to the different areas. Oparanya did, it was in Western, I believe Martha Karua and others were, was it in Embu or Meru? Yeah. Raila was in Nairobi and, there were others spread out across parts of the country. I mean, I think this week, save for Stuart Madzayo and the group in Kilifi, did we see any other leaders? And I guess the big question, Sam, is, where is Raila Odinga?
Well, we just saw the Senate of Nairobi County wearing some sufuria. What is sufuria in English? Sufuria in English?
So cooking
pot. Cooking pot.
Okay, cooking pot. Yeah, remember there was, I mean, it was elaborate with even a call of what was supposed to happen at midday. If you're on the road, you're supposed to stop and hoot and flash the lights.
If you were at home, get out and bang your pots and pans.
Exactly. I don't know how much of that happened, but also we started off with the weekend of both the government and the opposition sides daring each other. I mean, taking certain stances and telling the government, saying that I can assure you there's not going to be maandamano in this country, there's not going to be violence in this country anymore. The Azimio side saying that indeed this was going to happen. But when you look at the scale of what we witnessed yesterday, you don't see, especially the top leadership, you don't see it anywhere. I also take note that today the members of parliament from the Azimio side chose the comfort of parliament buildings to give a statement from there. I would imagine that because of the arrest of other leaders, including Babu, the member of parliament for Embakasi East, then they are being cautious and not to be at a place where you can have that unfortunate meeting, quote unquote, with the authorities. But really, for me, what I'm learning from this is it's just unsustainable, because for 3 days or for 2 days now, learners have not gone to school as they should. I have seen many schools taking a position of let's wait and see. We'll communicate as events evolve. And of course, as Jamila says, the communication yesterday from the Interior Ministry and the Education Ministry, I mean, it did so little to really give the confidence, especially to residents of Nairobi and Kisumu counties. And it can tell you, because children, parents, they watched what happened last week at New Kihumbwini Primary School in Kangemi. You don't want to be the one to send your child to a school and that happens. So what we are seeing here, it is unsustainable in as much as the scale of the demonstrations was way lower yesterday, and of course today even lower. You can see the sort of destruction that is going on, the sort of exchanges between protesters and the police. If you look at some of the images in Mathare constituency, for instance, I mean, the road, you can tell it's concrete, but there's also another layer of lots of rocks and stones that have been thrown all over. I don't think this is sustainable. Yeah,
and I think that's the question. Can they sustain the momentum? Because certainly this week is nothing like last week. Thankfully, of course, that there wasn't as much destruction this week as we saw last week. And so, what's the end game here? I guess, is the big question. I mean, it's, as someone remarked, the maandamano started with matters to do with the election, opened the servers, and then it moved to the cost of living, and then it's perhaps a call out to ask the people to then come out and protest against the rising cost of living. And now you start to wonder, okay, so what's the end game here? How do things go from here?
I think we are also witnessing a very interesting phase where a word like maandamano, which in Swahili should mean demonstrations. What are demonstrations? Demonstrations presupposes that there'll be a march. People will turn up and then they'll walk in the streets, placards, sing and things like that. But here is a word that is gaining a different meaning. And it reminds me of how the word kamukunji was used and how it came about. Kamukunji is used to describe a meeting. Twende kamukunji mkutano, and that is the meaning. But is maandamano getting the meaning of the word demonstrations, or is it coming to mean riots? Because what we have seen is, I don't think we've seen even once a successful march. Where there is a procession in the manner of what we see in France, what we see
even in South Africa.
Yeah. Because that's supposed to be the demonstration. What do we have? A lot of drama, violent drama, especially in some of the suburbs of Nairobi, considered to be strongholds of the opposition. And if we are not careful, maandamano will be the code word for riots. And what do they come with? Look at the pictures there. Come up with ugly pictures of confrontation between the police and protesters. Ugly pictures of looting and destruction of property. Ugly pictures of people getting injured in the process of of that confrontation. So I think we have to be honest as a country and discuss and say, when is it a maandamano really, and when is it a riot? Because what we have seen so far, we've not seen a successful execution of any march in the definition of what demonstrations are supposed to be. What we've seen are these running battles. And for a majority of Kenyans, and there's a majority actually, that stay home, especially in Nairobi, on a day like yesterday when the shops were closed, when you ask them what is maandamano, it's not about the procession, it's about the violent confrontations between the police and opposition supporters, which is a completely different meaning from what demonstrations should be.
Yeah, and you see the manner in which the confrontations happen between the police and the protesters is to try to prevent them from accessing the CBD. And so that's the flashpoint, and that's where quite a bit of that violence begins. But, even as we speak about the police and in the run-up to the start of the protests on Wednesday, like we said, we saw the flurry of statements from, government officials. So you see, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Education. And then we also saw what has now become quite a typical tool in this country, which is withdrawal of security. And we saw that for the former First Lady, Mama Ngina. We saw that for various Azimio leaders, including governors, senators, members of National Assembly. I think within 24 hours, it was restored. But I know this because I have based my take on this, on previous occasions. And this seems to be quite a common tool for the police ahead of something. Or if there is some sort of disagreement between certain members of elected leaders and, the government of the day, security is withdrawn. And that has happened, remember, for, they were called the Tanga MPs previously. Even before the Tanga MPs, then it was the NASA MPs and then the CORD MPs. This is quite a typical tactic that happens in this country.
Don't forget the former deputy president.
Yes, that's right. And, what's the phrase that we use? Reorganization of our security forces. And then they're restored. Sometimes maybe not to the level that they were before, but it's becoming a rather common tactic and practice, in our politics, which is rather curious.
It is a very interesting part of our politics because, like Lena says about the former deputy president, now the president. Remember that time the then Interior Cabinet Secretary, Dr. Fred Matiang'i, appeared before a parliamentary committee when I was telling them of how many property that the deputy president has, how many police officers were deployed to protect them, to take care of them. He even gave a litany of what that list of property were. And many wondered, was it really necessary, or was it the proverbial way of responding to a mosquito bite with a hammer? And of course, you can see.
Or intimidation tactics.
Exactly.
Flexing of muscle. We will show you serikali ni nani.
Yes, and you can see this continuously getting implemented. I remember, I think it was the start of the demonstrations back in March, and the Inspector General was saying that there's no way we can allow people who are protesting against the government, and of course, the police will have to deal with the illegal protests, but that they're now protected by police officers. So it's that uniqueness that you would want the police to go and deal with protests. The protesters are protected by the police. So up to that extent, it sort of makes sense, but then you wonder why. Someone like former First Lady, Mama Ngina Kenyatta, I don't think she's being protected because she's the mother of the former president, whom many people have said, especially from the Kenya Kwanza administration, that might be involved in financing of the maandamano. This is the former First Lady, the spouse of the first president, Jomo Kenyatta. So really, I don't know what the reason was to withdraw those police officers. But then again, it opens an opportunity for a conversation in the country because people have been asking how many security personnel are enough for who, where, when, and when do you get the threat getting mitigated to an extent that can be reorganized. But then again...
In which case, wouldn't it be having that conversation at a different space and time? And if we as a country deem it too much, change the laws, do whatever is needed in terms of reorganization, but it's always the timing around it. You know, we're talking about the Deputy President had his security withdrawn. Kikuyu Town MP Kimani Ichung'wah had his security withdrawn. Then Governor Waititu had his security withdrawn. This has even happened for John Lonyangapuo, who was the governor at the time when he was having some sort of disagreement with the powers that be. So, you know, the timing of it and the manner in which it's done, it's really just flexing muscles. So is it then a genuine conversation that we feel that, you know, police officers who would better serve the public are being used by the elected leaders, or let me rephrase that, are being deployed to protect the elected leaders? If that be the conversation, you know, it is hardly sustained beyond the moment of, you know, sort of carrot and stick.
Reminds me in 2017 when Raila Odinga, who was then a member of NASA, he was protesting about the scaling down and the withdrawal of his security alongside Kalonzo Musyoka.
Yep.
And at the time, of course, it's when they were really at loggerheads with then President Uhuru Kenyatta. And I think this year alone, from I think January to now, July, I think security for Raila and some of the Azimio leaders who formerly held government position, I think were withdrawn 3 times in March, on March 26th. I think there was another time in May. That security was also withdrawn. In July again, 17th, there was now the issue of again Martha Karua, Raila Odinga and Kalonzo Musyoka security was withdrawn. Again, you talk about timing. It's like the same thing in Afanyika. Same script, different cast, same situations. Because when you're at loggerheads, that's when mambo yanakupata Yvonne. And speaking about withdrawal of security and timing, one of our top stories today was about the arrest of members of parliament and politicians allied to Azimio, including Babu Owino, and we're getting reports, I think, right now of Mathare member of parliament, Anthony Olwoch, also being arrested this evening. We can try and confirm that. And of course, the whole situation about how Babu Owino and the others were arrested, they were held in undisclosed locations, and then finally some police station in, I think, Mwea, and then brought to Nairobi, and then that is about 72 hours later, and what the Constitution says about holding someone for 24 hours and then presenting them in court and the charges leveled against him. And that whole thing about some people who had been arrested au julikani waliko, and the whole situation about now umewashika utawashtaki na nini. Yeah, what exactly are the charges preferred against
But
these
did we
people?
hear words like subversion?
Yes, I think that's what was on the charge sheet.
When was the last time we heard words like those, Linus?
Subversion, Linus, wendo wakili hapa.
It's interesting, and let's see, because we can't also run ahead of the court process. I think it has just started.
It has begun, yeah. Okay.
And, I think one of the other things that really stand out lately, and I just want us to listen to Eric Theuri, the chair of LSK, speaking not too long ago. I think it was day before yesterday?
Day before yesterday,
Yes.
on Tuesday, yes.
Yeah.
It is crucial to note that the right to protest peacefully does not permit individuals the right to engage in violent or destructive behavior. Violence, vandalism, looting, or any form of aggression undermines the purpose and legitimacy of peaceful protests.
There you go, and it's back to this definition of maandamano and the place of peaceful protests, which still remains very much a foreign concept in Kenya. And we've covered many of these things. And maandamano, and I think the interpretation comes from how the struggle for multipartyism came about. It was always about defying a government ban on rallies. I think way back in 1990 rather, the first Sabasaba happened when Kenneth Matiba, Raila Odinga Charles
Rubia,
Martin Shikuku. These are the people who said, okay, we are going to enter Kamukunji grounds with or without a license. So that has sort of become the standard way of struggling politically. But there's something that has changed, which unfortunately is not reflected in how both our politicians and even the population is behaving. And that is the change in the Constitution of Kenya 2010, which sort of de-emphasized that control of freedom to assemble and all that. That is not yet happening. And you know, there are two sides to the whole story. And that is, the first bit is the argument put by the LSK chair there, who says non-peaceful demonstrations, when you have violent protesters, then it undermines the purpose. And I think earlier on we noted also the excesses of the police. So this is becoming a convergence of manners from bad manners from two ends. And I think the day will address that, where you have protesters who know that Maandamano doesn't mean destroying property or fighting or throwing stones. It means going out with your, and some of them, and by the way, you remember the young man with his banner, the one who unfurled it.
The placard.
The placard, yes. That is an example of a peaceful protester.
Yeah.
No stones, he's got a message and he showed it. When you look at some of the protests out there, you see people marching quietly or singing. In South Africa,
they form this long
it's very colorful.
chain. Yes, and
yes, and there's a lot of singing and all that. This is the kind of messaging and maturity that we need to transition to. But this requires maturity on the part of political leaders. Interpret the meaning of Maandamano correctly. Maandamano should not be the Sabasaba of 1990. It should not be the Sabasaba of 1998 when you are working against a certain political environment. A lot has changed. Similarly, the police and the authorities shift from 1988, from 1990 to 2010 and to 2023. What does the law tell you? Because we should test whether this is possible. Test the protesters and test the police, that it will be possible actually to have a peaceful march. And when you look at Kenyans, and sometimes we give ourselves a bad name, but Kenyans are actually capable of peaceful protests. Kenyans are capable of peaceful transitions and things like that.
We have done it.
But we need to keep testing so that we get used to them. For example, some of these things that protesters sing and all that, let's test them. Let the policemen also get used to that. You know, because right now the interpretation of any protest, whether you're marching, is confrontation. Prepare tear gas. And there was a protester. Was he a protester or a comedian? A policeman was just innocently passing by. And he said, "Abari officer, tear gas ilisha." You see, that is the interpretation of how the police and the public relate.
Should engage. And, you know, with all of that then, there have been the voices of reason just calling for dialogue, calling for a de-escalation of the tensions we have seen in the country. And I'd like us to go back to the president of the Law Society of Kenya, Eric Theuri, who was one of those calling for reason. And then we will speak about the religious leaders as well.
We call on all citizens, government officials, community leaders, religious organizations, civil societies to come together and answer the call for national dialogue. The Law Society is willing and ready to offer its expert mediators to bring together the different political factions in order to find lasting solutions to the challenges we face as a nation.
And he was not the only one. The religious leaders, the Kenya Catholic Conference of Bishops, I hope I got that right, also then held a press conference actually on the day of, did I get it right?
Kenya Conference of
Catholic Bishops.
Yeah, KCCB, yes.
Okay, the Kenya Conference of Catholic Bishops actually on Wednesday, just, you know, as the protests were going on. It was around noon, right? They, you know, had a press conference. If we can just listen to Martin Kivuva, where he said, you know, Kenyans must be willing to listen to each other. I mean, you know, they were obviously everybody saying calm down. Before we even get to the issues, it was toned down. Let's listen to Bishop Martin Kivuva.
Kenyans and our leaders must be willing to listen to each other for the sake of peace of our country. We condemn what we have seen simmering as ethnic-based violence spotted in some parts of our country.
Yeah, forgive me. He's actually Archbishop Martin Kivuva of Mombasa, Kisumu, Nyeri, and Nairobi.
Mombasa.
Mombasa?
Mombasa Archdiocese.
Mombasa Archdiocese.
Yes.
I'm getting schooled today in the ranking of the Catholic Church. But he does call for reason, asks everybody to tone down, listen to each other, which is what everybody is calling for, you know, at this point, and everyone's offering to mediate.
Yeah.
So, Jamila, everyone's offering to mediate, but I believe actually the religious leader said they've tried to reach out to them. There's been no response from the religious leaders.
We were here a few months back,
Yeah.
remember? When we had the first wave of Maandamano.
Yes.
And then when we were expecting it to escalate, we had the president have that press statement from State House and saying, well, we should talk to sitisha Maandamano, tuzungumze. And then we had this whole bipartisan talks. We had the committees from both sides of Kenya Kwanza and Azimio. We had the demands that were put on the table, including opening the server, high cost of living, IBC commissioners, stop stealing our members of parliament, you know, and all that. Those were from the Azimio side. And then on the government side saying this is only going to happen through parliament, and our issues is just this. We're not going to discuss everything else. And the push and pull about what we will discuss, what we will not discuss. They're not listening to us. They don't want what we want. Having sittings where one side does not come for it. And then ultimately Azimio says, well, we are not going to be party to this bipartisan talks. And during that whole period, the voices of reason, calls from religious leaders were there. Sikilizaneni, kaeni, zungumzeni. Na watu hawakuwasikiza. So what next, Yvonne? Because we kept saying we cannot continue the way we are. With the maandamanos and the loss of life and the damage to property. And we have had very, very strong words from both sides, from both the president's side, the government side, and the opposition saying, well, atuwasikizi, yeah? People, what we said last week, what want to talk at each other. No one is actually listening. And how far can this go on for? You asked that. How long can we continue? At what point will they say, okay, tusimame tuanze kusikiza religious leaders wanasema nini? Because sauti ya viongozi wa kidini ni muhimu. You know, they represent something sacred. They represent something that should be listened to. They represent an image of those who come across as wale ambao hawata pendelea upande wowote. They come across as being fair because of the offices that they hold. And I think at some point we need to start listening to them and think about tunataka nini exactly. Watu wakue na ukweli in terms of what exactly they want, Yvonne, because we cannot continue like this. The image that we are projecting, not just in the region, but to the rest of the world, is really pretty scary in terms of what people think about when they see Kenya and the maandamanos. International media has been covering us, showing all sorts of things that have been happening in Kenya. We've had the voices from the European Union ambassadors. We've had UNICEF speak about children. We've had all these reactions. What does that say about, let's say, for instance, a ship full of watalii who are planning to come to Kenya, and they see that, would they come? We have a tournament going on now, a rugby, a chipukizi, and I was seeing how they were taking the players to the field escorted by the police. Those are not good images, Yvonne, about what we see as a country. So something has got to give if we need to move forward.
Yes, and there are raising issues as well about, you know, what ails the country. So yes, calling for reason, but these are the issues that citizens are facing. Archbishop Anthony Muheria talked about, you know, the Finance Act, which, you know, is a matter that is in court, but of course elicited great debate in the country. I'd like us to listen to him, just, you know, saying, okay, you know, it's, let's sit down and talk, but let's talk about these issues.
The recently enacted Finance Act places an unsustainable burden on already distressed citizens, especially those within the low-income bracket. We, therefore, ask the President to repeal the Finance Act and institute a process that will seek to achieve the same goals within the context of the current economic context. So,
repeal the Finance Act. Just very quickly before we take a break, I don't know if you're able to tell us what that would mean. What would it entail?
Interesting. I don't know whether that's...
There's a matter that's in court. We won't get into that.
Yes.
And, you know,
yes.
The court has to decide on what it has to, the issues that are before it. But, you know, how possible is this? Because the calls are coming from outside the legislature, which is where laws are made.
Right. And this actually came up early in the week on Daybreak, the morning show. And apparently, once a law has been passed by Parliament, it cannot be revisited up until 6 months after the passage. But there's a window of opportunity that if indeed that is the desire of Parliament to repeal, to review, or to do whatever they want with the law, then there's an opportunity to pass, is it a procedural motion, so that you're able to cut that period and allow Parliament to take a look at it once more. And I would imagine that was also the thinking, because when President Ruto was calling for bipartisan talks that would see how the process of picking new commissioners can be revisited, the law that they were implementing, I think, was passed in October last year or thereabout. By the time he was making that advisory, which was in March, was it April 2nd? April 2nd. It was not yet 6 months to, since the passage of that law. But then again, you ask yourself, is it the view, is it the standpoint of the Kenya Kwanza administration that they would want to repeal the Finance Act? Never mind that at the moment, it has been opposed in court. The Court of Appeal this afternoon gave a direction that it cannot lift the conservatory orders as of now. There will be a moment to give a ruling in the coming weeks. So really, I don't know how much they're able to do as of now, but there are certain issues which I think we can look into after the break.
Yeah, and just interesting to understand what sort of options are there. But once again, in this country, seeking political solutions to the problems that face this country, including now one that is both an economic and a legislative issue. So, and one that is now also actually at the judiciary. So what were to happen if they decide to repeal or start that process? What happens to what's going on in the judiciary? Do we abandon that? Do the judges say, oh, okay, fine, all right, well, done and dusted. Looks like you're sorting it out. We'll just sit here and wait. And by the way, that is the conundrum facing other issues in this country. For instance, the IEBC. Remember that? Remember a selection panel?
Shortlisted candidates?
Shortlisted candidates, what's going on with that? So there's many issues that remain unresolved in this country, including, it seems, an election. We just can't seem to get over the fact that we had an election and it was resolved even at the highest court in the land. So we'll come back and talk a lot more about all those unresolved issues, because those still face us, protests or not. This is News Gang when we return.